Welcome to the 30th year of Naturalist Journeys at North Branch Nature Center. Which means it's also the 30th year of North Branch Nature Center, which is also very exciting, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that throughout the year. So thanks for coming and kicking us off, kicking this series off. So Naturalist Journeys, as many of you know, is our series that features ecologists and authors and scientists and travelers and photographers and all sorts of things like that, telling interesting stories about their work and their research and their lives. This year, though, we are doing a series all about rivers. So those of you that have been in our orbit for the last year here at North Branch know that we did a big fall series called Our Resilient Rivers, which was field workshops and field trips and programming and festivals all around learning about how watersheds work, how rivers function, how we as a Montpelier community, as Central Vermont, as the world can live in better relationship with our rivers. And so this Naturalist Journey series is a continuation of that conversation in presentation form. And then once the things warm back up this spring, we'll take it back out in the field for some more. If you've found your way to a seat tonight, it probably means that you know about the other programs that are going on in this series, but just to pitch them, and also for the folks that are watching on the live stream right now, next week you can come back on January 20th to hear from Michelle Braun with Friends of the Winooski River. Her program is basically understanding what a watershed is, and we'll trace the Winooski watershed from tip to tail, the headwaters all the way down to the mouth of Lake Champlain, and understand how water flows into and out of Montpelier as well. And then at the end of January, Shane Jaquith from the Nature Conservancy is going to be speaking about river management over time in Vermont, particularly around dredging and channelizing and straightening our rivers, and what the history of that looks like, when it's appropriate to do that today, and usually it's not appropriate to do it today, and kind of getting into some of the nuance around dredging and kind of like heavy-duty river management in Vermont. In early February, we'll have Kasha and Aaron from Friends of the Winooski River, from the Vermont River Conservancy, and they have their eye on all 7,000 miles of river in Vermont, and one of their jobs is to figure out how to prioritize which portions of river are kind of the biggest bang for the buck in terms of conservation for human safety and flood resilience. And so they'll kind of walk through their science of how they go about making those decisions. In mid-February, we will hear from, we'll watch a documentary and hear from the filmmaker, Bob King, all around hydropower. There are hundreds of dams in Vermont, some of which still generate hydropower, and they have an important role in our electricity portfolio and are full of all sorts of controversy and considerations and careful things to think about. And so we'll really get into the idea of how hydropower can be understood as part of our future with your relationships with rivers. And then in March, a program by one of our naturalist educators here at North Branch all around the riverside wildlife. So featuring all of the trail camera videos and compilation footage and things like that we've collected from otters and porcupines and mink and moose and beavers and all the rest, and understanding kind of how that all fits together into a tapestry of our riverside wildlife. So please come back for all of those. I want to thank our sponsors for making Naturalist Journeys possible every year and this year. So this year we want to thank Catamount Solar, Hunger Mountain Co-op, Waite Heindel Environmental, Onion River Outdoors, and Washington Electric Co-op. And also I want to say a special thank you to Lake Champlain Basin Program, who have been making all of this kind of river resiliency work possible. So how about a round of applause for all those great sponsors. This is being live streamed and recorded. Those of you watching are aware that this is being live streamed. You may not know that this recording of this live stream will be available online afterwards. That's true of almost all of our programs here. So if you want to experience this all again virtually later, you can do that on our website. If you want to go and look at our back catalog of all sorts of programs over the years, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations is the place to go for that. I think that's probably enough. That might not be all, but that's plenty. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Ali Kasiva, our UVM state extension forester with the UVM extension program. And Ali was here a couple years ago to talk with us about cycling of carbon in forests. And with all of the conversation we've been having around forests and water here in the Montpelier area, we thought it'd be appropriate to bring back Ali to discuss her more recent work around how water moves around forests. You've probably read her bio by now, so needing no further introductions, please help me welcome Dr. Ali Kasiva.
All right. Multiple microphones here. All right, I think that sounds like it's working, right? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out. I never know who's going to show up, like on a Tuesday evening, in the middle of winter. So I'm just always thankful. It's just so great. People want to hear about forests and water. So thanks. Hopefully this will be engaging and interesting. You'll learn something. That's really my hope always, is just people learn something, love forests. And we will have time for questions, discussion, whatever folks feel at the end too. So note that. All right, so here we go. All right, I'm going to talk today about forest hydrology. So really focusing in how forests store, how they absorb, how they store, and how they cycle water. So really some fundamentals of ecology. And obviously this is in the context of thinking about global climate change and the effect of more and heavier rainfall events that we're having. All right, so first off, I just want to talk about forests. This is really where my specialty comes in, is thinking about how trees work, how forests work together, how they interact with the soil and all the other parts of the forest to create this, amazing ecosystem that we know and love, and provides a lot of services that we really depend on. So how do forests affect hydrology? Whoop, here we go. Is it happening? There we go. All right. So a big thing that forests do is, as rain falls through the canopy, they capture water, right? So rain falls on leaves, on branches that captures the rain in the bark. That rain actually can get redirected around the base of the tree to the roots. Rain gets captured in dead, decaying wood on the forest floor, and of course the soil acts like a sponge. There's depressions in the forest floor that capture water. And then a big service that forests do that is really amazing and miraculous in the hydrologic cycle is they evaporate water back to the atmosphere. So some of the water that falls on a forest actually never makes its way into a stream. So these are the two big services that forests do in terms of hydrology. They slow down water. So water has to trickle through the vegetation, the forest floor, dead wood, leaf litter, and then through that soil. So that really slows down that process that a raindrop travels. And then the other thing that they do is not all of the rain or snow melt, any precipitation that falls on a forest, not all of that even makes its way into a stream. A lot of it evaporates back to the atmosphere. So I have a little schematic because there is some terminology about hydrology that I want to introduce. So you have this little, let's say this is a maple tree, right? So you have rainfall that falls on this tree. And the first thing that happens is not all that rainfall hits the ground. It actually is intercepted by the canopy. So that's the term we use, is canopy interception. And then some of that rain does trickle through, right? We know this. We sit under a tree and there's less rain. You get less wet during a rainstorm. You're still going to get wet. Some of that rain still falls through, and we call that throughfall. So that's a technical term. And another cool thing that we have with trees is this term called stem flow. And you might have seen this in a really heavy rainfall event, that the water will actually be flowing down the trunk of a tree. And essentially, the branches sort of funnel that water and it flows down that trunk, meaning that a lot more water will get into the ground around that tree. And actually, the water can follow the roots into the soil where there's space around those roots. As the tree moves, it creates some space in the soil. And so we have this process called stem flow. And so that's kind of what happens as rain falls on a forest canopy. Of course, it hits the soil, and the soil acts like a sponge. It's a good analogy. It absorbs that water. And this is a term we call infiltration, right? So that water finds areas in that soil, the pores, the air pockets, and fills up that soil. And that's how we get water storage. And if you have a well, there's things like aquifers deep in our groundwater, but we also have water that is just stored in the soil. In the little air spaces, the pores can fill up with water. And so there's water throughout a soil profile. And so what happens when that fills up is we actually see that water will move laterally in that soil profile. And this is the way that most water gets to a stream. It actually moves through the soil. And so that's a really important thing about stream flow, is that this, what we call subsurface flow is the technical term. Most of the water we see in a stream is actually old water. It's not that rain that just happened. That rain falls in the soil, and it essentially pushes out the water that's already in the soil, and that's the water that enters the stream. And of course, we can also have what we call runoff. Probably folks are familiar with this term. People call it overland flow as well. Essentially, the water doesn't make its way into the soil, and it goes across the surface of the soil. And that does happen, and there's some characteristics and some conditions that occur that make that more likely. But most time, the water is going through the soil and then coming out into the stream. And then another really cool property, and I've mentioned this already, is this idea of evaporation. And the technical term is evapotranspiration, and it's this process where water actually gets returned as water vapor from the forest. So how does this happen? Well, it's mostly because all green plants have these tiny little pores on them called stomata. And these are little openings, and this is the way a plant gets carbon dioxide, which it uses as a source of essentially food in photosynthesis to make carbohydrates. But what happens is that water leaves those little pores because they're little openings. And so that process means that water vapor evaporates back into the atmosphere. And then any surface, a leaf surface, soil surface, branch, anything like that, also just water will evaporate from that surface. And so we have this combined process in a forest we call evapotranspiration. And it's pretty cool because a large tree in the summer will transpire quite a lot of water vapor back to the atmosphere. It can be upwards of 50 gallons a day. And so when we look at a forest ecosystem as a total, most of the precipitation that falls on a forest actually goes back up to the atmosphere and never makes its way into a stream. So it can be upwards of 80% of the water that falls on a forest ecosystem. So this is really, really critical and a reason why forests are really important in hydrological cycles. The other cool thing about forests are their soils. So soils do a heck of a good job slowing down and absorbing rainfall. And so there is some research that's looked at. It's very hard to follow water through a forest, but has found that 90% of the rain and snow that falls on a forested watershed somehow interacts with the soil before it ends up making its way into a stream or ends up being evaporated through that process of evapotranspiration. So that's pretty cool, right? So the soil is a critical component in this hydrologic cycle. And what makes forest soils really cool is this organic, really rich organic layer. Most of our forests here in Vermont have it. So, this what gardeners would love to see. You see this in a lot of our forests, right? This really rich broken down leaf litter, plant matter, old insect exoskeletons, all this organic matter is really good at holding water. And so that means that these soils have high infiltration rates. So you drop water on them, that soil acts as a sponge and it really sucks up that water, right? You can compare this to arid environments, deserts, where actually water will fall on that surface and it will just sit there. There was a hydrophobic nature to some of those soils. We have great soils that in the most part really do absorb water very well. And so I mentioned earlier that this does mean as the water absorbs into the soil, it actually travels through that soil, slows down, takes really different paths through that soil profile, and ends up in our streams and our rivers. So that's sort of basic hydrology, forest hydrology. I wanted to talk too, because I got some questions and Sean gave me some prompts about there is a lot of interest in how different characteristics in a forest then affect hydrology. We have this baseline understanding of all these great things forests do, but of course forests are different. They have different species, different characteristics, and different land use histories. And so how do those things affect this service that we love and depend on? So first off, there are two different types of water service that we look at when we think of forests, or any ecosystem really. So water yield is the amount of water that comes off a watershed in a year. And so that is really dependent on different factors than this other type of flow, which is peak flow. So this is what we think of when we're thinking about flooding, a really extreme event. This is the maximum amount of water that's coming out of a watershed, right? So when snowmelt happens, when we get a flood event. And so we are often more interested in peak flow. If we're thinking about drinking water supply, that's where water yield comes into play. But both of them are really important, and forests do a lot to promote each characteristic. So there's a little bit of a difference in what affects what. Water yield, how much rainfall falls in an area over a year. Doesn't really matter if you get that water at different times of year. It's sort of the overall annual rainfall you get in an area, or snowfall. The amount of evapotranspiration, so how much is getting evaporated back to the atmosphere. What are the characteristics of that watershed? What's the land cover? That's a really important thing. So are we talking about forests? Are we talking about impervious surfaces, development, agricultural land? When we look at peak flow, this is when we're thinking about, did we get 5 inches of rain overnight? The rainfall intensity, how quickly that rain is coming. Also some things that occur, like, is the soil already saturated? Is there no more room for that water to be absorbed? Are there surfaces where the water can't be absorbed and will just run off? How steep is that landform that water is falling on? And of course, what is the vegetation like that can intercept that rainfall coming down? And so hydrology varies by a lot of different things in the forest, and it's really thinking about those steps, that interception, how many layers are getting, is that raindrop passing through before it hits the forest floor? How is it getting slowed down? How complex is that forest? Is there dead wood on the forest floor? Is there leaf litter? Are there depressions in that forest floor that can capture that water? Or is it really uniform? And then things like any stressors or disturbances that affect that forest then affect their hydrology. So I'll give you a couple examples of some things that affect hydrology that are interesting and can play a part in when we think about water and from a forest watershed. So some interesting things is that what we think about year-round, evergreens are going to do a lot more for us than deciduous trees, right? The deciduous trees, maple, beech, birch, don't have leaves for a good half of the year. And so anything like a spruce, a fir, that is going to trap more rain, and we can see it really obviously in the winter, right? They trap snow in their branches, and so they're going to keep that precipitation up in their canopy for a really long period of time. And so we do see that there's big differences based on what species grow in that watershed. And of course, we see differences based on soil. This is probably one of the biggest ones. So this is a photo of a pretty shallow soil. This is some bedrock underneath, this tree tipped up. Excuse me, I moved away from the mic. This tree tipped up. We can actually see the root system that's spread out. The roots weren't able to go down deep because there wasn't enough soil. This is a situation where there isn't really anywhere for water to go. So depth of soil, the texture of soil, if you can think about like a really clay soil that might exist closer to Lake Champlain versus a sandier soil, is going to absorb water at a much slower rate. And different soils have a different ability to hold on to water and store water. So there's really, really big differences based on what the soil is like at that very site. There's also a lot of differences in what the forest floor looks like. And if you've come to any of my talks or read any of my work, I am a big proponent of deadwood. A lot of our forests are missing this component because of our land use history, but we know deadwood does an immense role in several things, and one of them is storing water. Holds on to water very, very well, even in times of drought. And so there is some research that looks at how much water deadwood can hold, and it can hold, in some cases, 80% of the rain that falls on that log. Of course, there's differences based on species, so some species hold more water than others. Anytime you have something very decaying, like this photo on the left, this very decayed old maple log that's actually up in the woods behind my house, that's going to hold more water. So think of that really decaying wood that's spongy, and you touch it and you can kind of put your fingers into that log. That's going to hold on to water really well, better than obviously a freshly fallen log. And we have these examples of situations like this where moss is growing on these logs that enhances that water holding capacity of that dead wood. Another feature we like to see in the woods is what we call pit and mounds. Anything where the forest floor is not perfectly flat. You can actually see in this photo, it's a little bit wet in here. It might be hard to tell, but this is a slope going down from sort of the right side of the screen down to the left. And there's this nice depression here, and there's water that has pooled in that depression. It doesn't have to be a big, really big area for water to get trapped, and it slowly sinks into those areas. And then again, there's research that has quantified this value in terms of water infiltration of the soil, and it can increase, of course, that amount of water that gets stored into the soil by a huge amount, right? Rather than this water running off that slope, essentially gets trapped and is able to be absorbed. So this does mean that land use history is a really, really key factor in hydrology. And this is important here in Vermont and in the Northeast in general, where almost all of our forests have been touched in some way by past land use. And so examples here is an area that I would imagine was previous agricultural land. It's very flat. This forest floor, when I look at this, I don't see any depressions or dips in the forest floor. It's pretty uniform. And you can compare this. The trees are not of that different size in these two photos. And it might be kind of hard to see with the lights, but this one has some dips in the forest floor. It's just not nearly as flat. There's also wood logs on the forest floor of different decay statuses. Some have moss on them. Here you don't really see much. This is a fairly freshly fallen treetop, and maybe there's something back here. There's a lot more complexity in the forest floor in this right-hand photo. And so, when you think about rain falling on this system, there's a lot more places for that rain to get trapped and be absorbed versus a system like this. There's been a lot of interest in how forest age affects hydrology. And so I'm showing here two different forests of different forest ages. This is a fairly young forest here on the left. It has a lot of what we call early successional species, birch, paper birch, and pin cherry in here. And it's really rapidly growing. This is a stand that's probably 15 years old. And then over here we have an old growth forest. You can see there's a standing dead tree up in the forefront, what we call a snag. There's dead log off to the side here. A lot of complexity, a canopy gap, trees of different sizes. And this is an old growth forest that was never cleared. And we do see differences in hydrologic benefits based on forest age, but it's actually much more complex than a simple answer, because what happens is here in this very young forest we have very high evapotranspiration. So that process I mentioned earlier of water leaving the leaves. These trees are growing very rapidly. They're competing to grow tall and get to the sunlight before their neighbors. There is quite a lot of green leaves here. And so they have a lot of, they process a lot of the water out into the atmosphere. Over here, we get a lot of interception. There's a lot of complexity. As the rainfall falls on this old growth canopy, it hits lots of things. There's a lot of dead wood to hold onto the water, deep soils, a lot going on. And so these are providing, very different benefits and functions in terms of hydrologic processes. And so there's really no one better or worse, as long as what we want to see is that soils are intact and functioning, able to absorb and act like that sponge, that they provide that service. What we see more strikingly is that certain characteristics provide those hydrologic benefits. And so we can actually look at this less so on forest age, more so on is there complexity? Is there diversity? Is there deadwood? Are there pit and mounds in that forest floor? Those are the things that provide those benefits more so than forest age alone. And so what we see is that higher interception and evapotranspiration is really associated with a lot of leaves. We want a situation where we have a lot of leaf cover. We have a lot of different layers in the forest, and you can compare that to this forest over here, which is what we call old field white pine, grew up on old agricultural land. These trees, they don't have a huge canopy. They're really, really small canopy, so not a lot of needles up in the crown. There's not a lot of vertical layers in this forest. Really, these are all the same age trees, quite close together. And so that interception by canopy is pretty limited. And so most of the rainwater will fall to the forest floor. Conversely, this more complex forest over here just has a lot of things that are going to intercept that rain and hold on to that water for long term. But we do know that any reduction in forest canopy reduces those hydrologic benefits. And so there's a number of ways that we can see this happen. So for example, here we have poor hemlock. This is down in southern Vermont. We have some of the first hemlock dying from the introduced hemlock woolly adelgid, a tiny insect that basically robs carbohydrates from hemlock trees and can kill them. And so this tree is dead. It should have evergreen foliage, and it doesn't. And so the lack of that, especially across a large scale, is going to have impacts to the hydrology. Certainly fire, any fire that is strong enough to kill vegetation, particularly overstory trees, is going to have a huge impact on hydrology. Things like windstorms, anything that really knocks over, and reduces the canopy. Timber harvesting removes trees from the system, so that will have a similar impact. And then as well as this is an example of development for a single family home. ex-urban development, clearing of an area, clearing of the trees and the vegetation. Oh, look at that, my thing got bumped down. But basically, any reduction in canopy is going to lower that interception of rain. So it's not going to have surfaces to hit on the way down, and then there's not going to be as much evapotranspiration. So we're not going to return a lot of that water back to the atmosphere. So you can get a lot more runoff. What is dependent on these, the outcomes, is how long these disturbances last, right? All 4 of these hopefully are transient and the forest recovers. Maybe different species come in than were there previously. Of course, this last one is a semi-permanent transition of forest cover to some impervious surface. And so when we look at timber harvesting, there's been a lot of interest in how does timber harvesting affect hydrology? And a lot of this work is actually fairly old. You might not be able to see. I have lots of citations at the bottom. I mean, this work has gone back, there's been interest many, many decades ago about water impacts from timber harvesting. And there were these what we call whole watershed studies, and our closest one is over in New Hampshire at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. I've done quite a bit of work at. There's been incredible research there for many decades to look at different ecological processes over a large scale. And so what we see on these watershed studies is that if we look at, you might not be able to see this because this is a pretty old figure, so the resolution is not great, but at the bottom here, it's the amount of what we call basal area. It's just the amount of wood volume that's removed from a watershed. And as it goes up, we have more dots over here, and these come from different locations in the United States. Up here in this square is the Appalachians. That would include us. These studies come from all around the United States. And then over here we have the change in water yields, the amount of water coming off that watershed. And basically, and this is just one compilation of several, this is many studies around the United States, but there's a lot of work that's gone into this. And all of them show pretty similar responses, that we get higher impacts the more trees that are removed from a watershed, right? So if you get up to 100% of the watershed removed versus 10 or 20% of the watershed removed, there's really different impacts on water yield. And in fact, that pretty much every study has found that when you're below about 20%, 25%, the impacts on water yield are not significantly detectable. So that's using statistics. And the research has shown that below this threshold around here, you can't detect. And that's over a whole watershed, right? So you have to think about scale and amount and proportion of trees that are removed. The other thing this research has shown is that the impacts are most evident after a timber harvest occurs. And they persist for a few years. And this is showing a clear cut, an entire watershed was clear cut. Right, so these studies were really, really drastic. I will show you some other examples of very drastic studies. Completely clear-cut watershed, and shows an increase in flow, water flow after that, and that persists for a number of years and then returns to this baseline condition. So for the most part, all these studies have shown about 5 to 10 years of impacts and then return to baseline. So I'll show you some examples. These are from Hubbard Brook, as I mentioned. There's a couple, they have these full watershed studies. So this was an example of a full clear cut of the watershed right here. And then they herbicided the watershed for 3 consecutive years. So very intense management, not something anybody should ever do. And so we see that this has obviously a huge effect on the water budget, water yield, and then returns to sort of around a baseline. And actually what we see in a lot of these is there's a decrease in the water yield after a certain amount of time. And what this is showing us is back to that sort of young forest versus old forest component, is that when we have this really rapidly growing young forest, once the trees are able to get established on this site, you have a lot of growth, right? And we've all seen this in places where trees are rapidly growing. And that photo I showed, a lot of leaf area, a lot of evapotranspiration, and so that's actually using a lot of the site's water. And so we actually see, in some cases, a reversal of the water yield when that recovery happens. And so there's a couple other examples here from Hubbard Brook. They had one where they had 95% of the watershed was harvested. This is a whole tree removal, which means they remove all the branches, everything from the site. And then this is another example where they did progressive, what they call strip cuts, which is basically cutting trees in strips, and they cut a third of the watershed, then a third of the watershed, then a third of the watershed. And so, none of these I would promote these practices by any means, but they're helpful in understanding that there are different impacts depending on the severity of the timber harvest. And so, we can take some of these concepts, that were done many years ago. A lot of these were done in the 70s and 80s, to understand, okay, well, let's come back from that. How can we make it so we can't actually detect that a timber harvest was happening at all? And so just to point out, this is an example of a timber harvest that happened at Heinsberg Town Forest in the background. And this is, a lot of what we're promoting as forest management, a good ecological forest management. This is not a clear cut, we're not clear cutting an entire watershed here, leaving dead wood, leaving large pieces of trees or whole trees to decay, hold water, a lot of vertical complexity, getting these layers, a lot of species diversity. And so, when we think about the impacts of these sort of timber harvests, much more minimal, if not undetectable, on the watershed scale. There's also been some research looking at the impacts on hydrology of defoliation from insect pests. This is a defoliation that happened in southern New England from the spongy moth caterpillar, which is an introduced caterpillar to the United States, and it loves eating oaks in particular. And southern New England has lots of oaks. It will also eat other species, including maple and hemlock and lots of other species, but it loves eating oak leaves. And what folks saw, similar to a timber harvest, any removal of the canopy will cause a change in the water budget. And so they looked at this defoliation metric and saw that when there was higher defoliation, more water ran off those watersheds. The other thing we do see, the other impact we see based on land use is from roads and trails. And so this is something that is very pervasive through our state and our region. We have a lot of old trails, currently used trails, some are not used, some are abandoned. But anytime we have compaction of that soil, that's going to reduce the ability of water to infiltrate that soil, and it can increase erosion. And this is actually this is likely an old carriage road, maybe was used for logging. It's now a mountain bike trail. And so they can be used for lots of different purposes. They all have the same impact, and it depends on their width, but they all reduce infiltration of water to some degree. All right, so I did want to talk a little bit about how climate change is affecting hydrology. I'm sure a lot of you are aware and probably why you're here, thinking about our changing climate and the rainfall we're getting, the heavy rainfall events that we're experiencing. And so an interesting thing about climate change, and this is just a phenomenon about water and temperature, is that when we have warmer air, it can hold more water. And so that's what we're experiencing here in the Northeast. We're seeing more precipitation. and more heavy rain events. And that's sort of the fact of it. As we see that increase in temperature, we're going to see more rain overall and more heavy rainfall events. Interestingly, there isn't really a definition of heavy or extreme rainfall events. I was really surprised at this, that meteorologists and climatologists don't have a universal definition. It's a little bit of one of those things that it just depends on you'll know it when you see it kind of thing. And this is a photo of a rain gauge I have in my garden, and this was just from this past October. Got 5 inches of rain, and it didn't cause any damage. And so this is the interesting thing about heavy rainfall events. It depends on several factors, including how quickly did that rain come, over what time, the intensity. Also depends on that soil. Was the soil already saturated, right? In Tropical Storm Irene, it was one of the big impacts is that we had already had rain and the soil was saturated. So, the definition is really like if there's more rain than what is typical. I sort of use the rule of thumb that it's more rain than we get. If you get more rain in a day than you get in a month, that's heavy, and that's about 3 inches for us. But it is important to know you could get less than that over a short time frame, or and it could still cause damage, or more than that over a longer time frame, and it doesn't cause damage. And so it is a little bit of a mystery to understand really how do we forecast the impacts from these events. But we are seeing changes in these heavy rain events. Climatologists have looked at this. This is from our National Climate Assessment. That's a really great resource. This is the one from 2023. And so this is for the Northeast, includes Vermont. I'm a little bit more strict with what I call the Northeast. This goes all the way down to the Mid-Atlantic area, so it's a wide swath of land. But what you'll see here is they divide precipitation events into the number of inches. So we have 2 inches up here, has increased about 50% over this time frame, which is about since the 1950s. Then we have days of 3 inches. This has increased a larger degree, so 60%. What I think is very interesting is we're seeing bigger increases proportionally in these larger events. So 4 inches of rain has increased 84%, and 5 inches of rain, right, which was once a pretty uncommon experience, is now going from 5 events up to 15, right? That's a pretty big increase. Again, this is for the entire Northeast. And so that's increased over 100% in that time frame. And projections of heavy rain events is going to increase. And so this is a map of New England, New York area showing future change in these heavy or extreme rainfall events by the end of this century. And this scale is showing percent change. Where we are, it's projected to be 30% increase. Other places in the Northeast, upwards of 40% increase in the number of extreme rainfall events. So that could be right to go from 10 to 20 or 15 to 30 events of a certain size is significant. And so what this means for our forests is that we could have more runoff. It's very likely we've seen some of these events where we have downstream flooding and we have runoff from our hill areas and our mountain areas. And so we do know that there are factors that can increase that risk. And the two big ones are low interception. So if we're not intercepting that rainfall as it comes through, so if we have places that don't have forest cover, right, that's going to impact that. If there's other things that we can think about in terms of the forest floor, and this gets into some of the things we can do to hopefully support forests and the provisioning of this service. Or if we have low infiltration, and some of these are things that we have no control over, right? Shallow soils, rocky outcrops. We have a lot of places in Vermont that are that, right? Coming off Mount Mansfield. My woods, very rocky, and so there's only so much water that can be absorbed into those soils. If we have compacted soils, though, that's something that we have a role in, and we could help rectify. Certainly steep slopes is something inherent, but lack of microtopography is something we can think of if we manage our own woods. So I will say, just as a caveat, that most of the studies, I mentioned all these studies that happen over many decades, they're mostly on normal events. It wasn't on people's radar to look at 5-inch, 6-inch rainfall events. They're on 1-inch, 2-inch events. And so there is a lot about these events we don't know. And so that is an important caveat, that there is uncertainty. They're very hard to study in a natural way too because of their rarity. And so folks just haven't done as much work research-wise on them. All right, so for the last section, I do always like to give folks some ideas of things. This isn't, the whole concept here is there's no one size fits all. There's many things that we can do to help steward forests and strengthen our landscape's ability to provide some of this resilience that we certainly need. And so I'm just going to give some ideas of different things that we can do, and it really depends on the situation where they'd be most applicable. But I will say it is something that I'm increasingly advocating that we all do need to prepare for these kind of events. Right? We do know that there are things we can do around our houses, right? Even if we don't have land, things to reduce the water coming off our roofs, off our driveways. There's a lot that we can do in our towns and our cities to minimize some of these risks. I mean, really what we want to do is slow down water and keep it absorbed where it can be most useful, right? So certainly in the woods, in the forest is great. Wetlands, not going to talk too much about wetlands, but of course those are incredible for their ability to take in and absorb water and store water. But this is my road. I live in Bolton. We've been washed out, I don't even know, in the last decade, 5 times that I've been stranded. Very steep, incredibly forested, 98% forested, right? So huge forest component, very, very steep, very rocky. And this is my neighbor's driveway, and they were stuck until the road crew could get them out. And so it's really imperative that we're all thinking about how we can, we're not going to, these events are happening, but are there things we can do to reduce their risk? And I will say that, forests can't prevent flooding. We do see that these heavy rain events, there's only so much water that they can absorb. I will give us, some tips and things we could all think about. And I don't know if they're going to all, work. The idea is we try a lot of different things across the landscape. We are creative, and we think about ways that we can help steward forests ecologically, and hopefully then they provide us with these things that we depend on. So one of the phrases that we use, and I didn't come up with this is something that is being passed on, is this idea of slow spread sink water, right? So decades ago, there was a lot of channelization of water, right? Move water through as fast as we can, and it sounds like Shane Jakewith will be talking about this in a few weeks. He's a great speaker. I work with him a lot from the Nature Conservancy, but this idea with, folks dredged rivers, speed up the flow of water, and now we've recognized that that is not the best. We really want to slow it down, spread it out, and allow it to be absorbed, in the forest where it is doing a good service and where the soils can accommodate it. And so, if you are a landowner or steward of a town forest, one of the best things to do is go walk the woods right after a rain event. You'll see where the water is flowing. And what we want to look for is anywhere that, leaf litter is being moved or logs, and particularly where erosion is happening. And so we're looking for that surface runoff erosion that's happening. And usually water is going to find that easiest way down. And as it keeps finding those spots, it's going to accelerate and cause more and more erosion. And these can be places where we can do some work. And, of course, these are photos that I've been taking after a lot of these rain events, making sure that any infrastructure we have in the woods for trails, for snowmobile trails, for woods roads, sugaring, that they can accommodate these extreme flows. I've seen this all over the place. It's on our town roads, right? These culverts are obviously undersized, they get clogged, and then this is pretty catastrophic, that they cause a ton of erosion around them. You can kind of see this channel on this right one. It's just digging a deep ditch from all this water that's flowing around this culvert. You know, I don't love culverts. I will say, I just seen them fail so many times. I get why they are used. If you can use something other than a culvert, it's great, right? A bridge, a dip, a ford, you know, something that if you don't need, especially year-round access, they just have such a tendency to get clogged, and they seem like a liability. They are easy to put in, but we really do have to make sure that they can accommodate a big rain event. I did bring a few of these out on the table out there, and it exists digitally. This is a really great resource from the state of Vermont on Vermont water quality. It's for logging jobs, for timber harvesting, but there's a lot of great tidbits if you are manage a trail network or have trails on your property, even if it's not for logging, about how to divert water and how to keep those trails from eroding. And this is really focused on maintaining water quality adjacent to these logging operations. So it has some really good ways to think about water. I mentioned this already, another photo of my road. You know, minimizing channelization of water as much as we can. And sometimes it's inevitable, but getting water out of channels into places where it can be absorbed in the forest. Because what we see about water, I mean, it's a cool phenomenon. Water can move a heck of a lot when it speeds up, but it is a force that when we see it double in velocity, it can increase its force by 4 times. So that's when you see boulders getting moved, or huge amounts of soil and sediment. And so we really want to slow that water down as much as possible. So when we think about any roads that we have, so this is like a sugaring operation. You can see my dogs up here, moving water off this traveled surface. And for example, here, I love this. This is some mountain bike trails in Bolton at the driving range, it's called. This is really beautiful trail work here, using rock, durable rock, and they have this little way to get the water coming off this slope here, so this isn't going to erode. This has ability to be traveled. Nothing's going to get clogged, no culvert. Really beautiful, great work done here. And so yes, this takes a lot of effort, but hopefully this is something that will last a very, very long time, regardless of the amount of water that comes over this surface. The other thing that we see pretty pervasively is past logging, skid roads up in our woods. And what I'm seeing increasingly is that these are becoming more and more eroded as we have these heavy rainfall events. And so I'm very much an advocate of us thinking about how we can repair these. And in some cases, if someone has equipment, they're up here, but even just getting some dead wood in these systems to sort of slow down this channelization of water that's coming down these depressions here, because those are just going to get worse over time, and they're really on these steep slopes and pretty erodible. And one way we can do some of this is using dead wood, something that's free in the woods, has all these other benefits, provides habitat for insects and salamanders and fungi. And so I really encourage people to think creatively about how to use dead wood, and I do this in my own woods. And you see it happen naturally, right? So dead wood falls on the forest floor, and it traps leaf litter. It's going to hold back water. I already talked about how much water they can hold themselves, but even stopping that runoff event that can happen. And so increasingly, folks who manage forests are doing this intentionally, leaving logs on the ground. And I will say, in general, bigger is better. It will last longer, it will hold more moisture, it will do more. But anything you can add is really great. We really lack, pretty much all of our woods in Vermont lack sufficient dead wood on the forest floor. And this helps also with nutrient cycling, with carbon storage, protecting soils. There's so many benefits of dead wood, but we can also think about it in terms of hydrology as well. And of course, a big thing is keeping vegetation along waterways, these beautiful stream beds that we all love to go swimming in the summer, keep them cool by keeping vegetation along them. But this is true if any sort of waterway, and really encouraging folks to maybe even plant in those riparian buffers. We have places like along the Winooski. There are folks that are thinking about how to improve the hydrologic functioning of some degraded forests that we have here in Vermont. And so I showed you this photo before, Oldfield White Pine. And so this is the idea where this is active forest management here. And you can see there's still some of these remnant old, these white pine. They're not very old actually, but that were left on the site. And removal of some of these trees opened up space and light for some hardwoods to come in. You can see there's dead wood left on the forest floor. So a lot more complexity. We're increasing that leaf area. We're increasing the interception of rainwater here. We're increasing evapotranspiration. And so this is going to be a benefit to the hydrologic functioning. Not to mention this forest is pretty vulnerable in this stage because it can blow over quite easily. And so folks are trying to, there are folks that are working to move that needle in some of these forests. And we do have a really great resource. This comes from the U.S. Forest Service. They've come up with what they call these menus of adaptation strategies. And they have ones for forested watersheds that help foresters think about incorporating some of these principles into their management. And then I think this is the last strategy I wanted to mention, and I hope Shane talks about this when he's here in a few weeks, because this is the stuff I work with him about, is he's really been leading the state in what we call strategic woody additions. So this is the idea of adding wood back to streams. Would have been there, that in an old growth forest, there's a heck of a lot of dead wood in the streams. We cleaned out a lot of streams to improve their flow. And a lot of our forests are really young and they just haven't developed that characteristic. And we recognize now the benefits of having that dead wood in streams. It's really good for trout habitat and all the invertebrates that live in streams, but it's also good for flood resilience, for reducing peak flows. And so folks are actually going and adding those in, and you add some big pieces of deadwood, whole trees, other things kind of get stuck behind it. And what you can see here is this is a stream that's pretty what we call incised. So it was eroded over time, and adding this sort of debris dam actually lifted the level of the stream back here up quite a bit. Some other examples, some of them, we get some natural debris dams that happen, and this is an example of foresters from Red Start Consulting who are doing this work and adding trees back into a stream bed. Again, this is an example of a very incised stream. The stream bank is way up here. So the idea is we're trying to lift back up that level of the stream to what it would have been before it eroded. All right, so that's what I have for some ideas of things we can do across our landscape. I did just want to plug, I brought a number of them out and back at the table, but also they exist digitally, several resources, and there's lots of other folks in the state and region that are providing science-based resources to help folks make decisions, thinking about climate change, thinking about some of these heavy rainfall events that we're having. At my website, please, reach out if you have any questions. I'm always happy to talk to folks. If you have anything you'd like to follow up, and I'm also happy to answer questions if anybody has any. Yes.
Hi, I have 3 questions actually.
Okay.
One is, if there's on our land, there's a channel that was dug because of the flooding that happened a few years ago.
Oh.
What would be your recommendation for like should we fill that channel with deadwood?
Okay, I will repeat. I'm going to repeat questions too because there are folks online to make sure. So there was a question about a channel had been dug on your property after the storm, and what should you do with it? It's hard for me to give like concrete recommendations without seeing the context of it.
Well, that was my second question. Is people who could come out to Worcester and look at our land.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not in the forest. It's like around your homestead or.
Yeah, it is forested there.
It is forested.
It's along a road. It is forested.
Okay, because always when you have forests, you can always reach out to your county forester. Their state of Vermont, and it's a free service, no matter what size parcel you have. That is usually their expertise is forest, but they also know about roads and forests and things like that. Might be someone to look at. Yeah, so it's hard for me to say not knowing or like why. I mean, there are, why it was dredged. Was it to protect a home or something like that?
Yeah, I think they were trying to get the water to go in the channel instead of in the yard.
Right. Yeah. So there is things like that happen. Yeah. So I don't. It's a good question. I probably wouldn't, especially if it's close to like property and things like that. There might be different considerations that you'd have. In a forest situation, where you're not protecting a house or something like that, that can be an option, is to put, is to like intentionally fell a log in, but I don't know if I would do that in that situation if there was like a specific reason. Mostly when I was suggesting that is when that's happening naturally because we have these old skid roads up in the woods or an old trail that hasn't been maintained, and as that water keeps flowing down, especially in these heavy rainfall, it will just keep scouring and channelizing and making a deeper and deeper depression if there's no intervention. So what you're talking about is like slightly different. So yeah, I'm sorry I don't have.
So to reach out to
yeah.
County, what's it called?
County forester, yeah. Where do you live?
Worcester.
So yeah, I have to look at they've switched around the county foresters. They're not actually county-based anymore. They're town-based, even though they're called county foresters. There's a great map. Actually, if you reach out to me, I can help point you in the right direction. If you send me an email, I'm happy to get you connected to someone who might be able to help, yeah. Yes?
Are Lakeland foresters moving toward this use of deadwood and woody additions?
Yes, definitely the deadwood in the forest is something that we're seeing a lot of folks do. Foresters, we are seeing there's a cultural barrier, and actually comes from landowners a little bit more. So a lot of landowners that want their woods looking tidy. It's a sort of like, it is a cultural thing, right? They want this park-like idea that it should be big trees and you should be able to see underneath it, which is actually not what our forests naturally would look like. So a lot of it is education to get folks to understand that it's not bad, you're not doing something wrong if that's what your forest looks like. And then, so if they hire someone to do work, that person who does the work wants to make sure that their client is happy, right? And doesn't think, oh, I left a messy work site because I left. And so it's just a lot of educating and getting folks to understand the benefits from all sides. But definitely, folks are realizing the importance of it. And also it can save some work if you end up, right? If you have a very dense forest, all the same age tree, if you leave some in the woods, that's trees, and that might not be a very valuable tree. It saves you from moving that tree from out of the woods too. And so a lot of times the contractors can be happy to do it once they understand the sort of the reasoning behind it.
And are the contractors or the foresters, do they feel that they can start that conversation with the landowners to say, well, we had a pretty bad flood back in 24 and then in 23, and if we leave this deadwood, the water won't flow as fast, it won't have as much force, there will be less erosion.
Yeah, and I realized I didn't repeat your first question, so hopefully the people online, the question's about folks doing this and leaving deadwood. So yeah, having that conversation with landowners, absolutely. I mean, part of that's what Extension helps with is providing like easy to understand resources for folks, to entry points to learn about the benefits, and recognizing this is, you know, things change, right? How we think and value forests has changed a lot over time, and recognizing that. And some people are going to be faster to that change, and some people are grew up in different times. And so that's, you know, and recognizing that. And also that one phenomenon we see is that when we experience a natural disturbance event, that is the thing most on people's mind. And so right now, heavy rain events are absolutely on people's mind, but I don't know that that was true 15 years ago. I would say before Irene, right? And we did have them, but it just seems like, I mean, they really have ticked up, right? And even when I moved into Bolton about 15 years ago, and it was right after Irene, and I asked our neighbors, and I said, we've never seen something like this, right? And since then, we've had 5 events like that. And so it does change your frame of mind. And so people are more apt to adopt practices when they think it affects their livelihood or their community and things like that. And so, so we're hoping that people can latch onto it. I will say that, as I said, deadwood is really good for so many other benefits too. Folks who are really interested in carbon, deadwood is great for that as well. And so a lot of trees, if you want to regenerate certain tree species, they need deadwood to regenerate on. Yellow birch and red spruce, hemlock, they don't really regenerate on the forest floor as well as they regenerate on decaying wood. And so folks that are interested in species diversity or succession in their forest, that's also really important. So trying to come in at different ways, but we're getting, you know, similar ecological outcomes. Yes?
I have 2 questions. One is, would you be willing to just discuss the concept of negative selection in forest management? And this is going way up.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck by the severity of our drought,
Yeah.
and I wondered if it could be a connection with the Canadian forest burning, or is the Canadian forest part of our biotic pump system?
Yep. Okay, I'll answer the second question first, just because it's in my mind. So second question was about the drought that we had this past, and I was actually thinking about that as, so this past August, September, October, we had a very severe drought, but we've actually been we were in a drought for a lot longer than that, that had to do with low snowpack. So our water tables were already really low, so there's different types of drought that some come across really sort of a slow background drought we don't notice, and then we have those really intense acute droughts that we saw in August and September. And yeah, it's certainly worrisome. It is something that has been a projection of climate change for a while, is that we will see more extremes. And so this idea that what we know as the typical climate here in Vermont, we're going to have more on either side of the spectrum. And that's just going to be the nature of a more volatile climate. So climate change is caused by basically we're trapping more heat in our atmosphere, and that changes the Earth's energy balance. And so that change is creating a lot more volatility. And so we're going to see basically extremes on every weather event. And so it can seem like what we call weather whiplash, where we have deluge, we have a lot of rain, and then we have drought and there's deluge. And that's really, it's challenging. It's challenging to think about what to do. I will say a lot of these tactics or strategies hopefully are good ecologically in a lot of different ways. So the deadwood, also good in a drought, because that deadwood will hold water a lot longer than soil without deadwood, just for an example. I don't know about the tie-in with the forest fires. I mean, certainly there's a tie with forest fires and more severe drought in a lot of those systems, which is why we're seeing more extreme forest fires throughout the world, and potential for our area to have more fires. We are seeing conditions that are droughtier and windier. So there is potential for us to have fires here. So I don't know, I can't really comment too much on the tie of that. Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But yeah, certainly the volatility of the weather is something. We didn't have a lot of rain for a long period of time. And one thing we're seeing when we have, those sort of events, we're calling them hot droughts, is when we don't have rain, but also the air temperature is higher than maybe it would have been historically. And so then you just get a lot more evaporation. And so that phenomenon of evapotranspiration, water is getting sucked from the soil, from leaf surfaces, and actually gets sucked from those stomata on the leaves. And the trees, what they do is they close those stomata. Some of them don't. Different species have different adaptations, but they do that. But that means then they're not taking in carbon dioxide, and they can't make new food for themselves. So they're basically hunkering down and waiting out the drought, which they can do because they store carbohydrates in their trunk and in their roots, but they can only do that for so long. And so when we see really prolonged drought, we do see mortality. I'm actually sort of interested to see what things look like next summer. There's some pretty droughty spots, some rock outcrops and things like that, where we might have had some mortality from this past drought. But you did have a first question. Can you repeat that?
Well, it's actually not related to hydrology.
Yeah.
But it's the concept of negative selection with forestry.
Can you clarify what you're...
That if you only take the really healthy great trees and then you end up with the crappy ones.
Okay.
Those are the ones that are reproducing.
Absolutely. Okay, so the question is about negative selection with forestry, idea of taking, good trees. So yes, this was a very common practice, and we're really moving away from it, and it's called high grading. Actually, it's a negative connotation in the forestry world. It's taking the best and leaving the worst. And it is what happened in a lot of our forests here in Vermont. People were doing things by hand and maybe didn't know a lot about forest ecology. We didn't have a lot of science. And that's what we are left with. And it actually does mean a lot of our forests have had repeated high grading.
Sorry, what's that word?
So it's taking out the best trees. So you're essentially high grading out, you're taking out the most valuable trees, which are certain species, and the biggest trees. And so we're left with that. A lot of forests, had that, and so maybe the less straight trees were left, or the poorly formed trees, or certain species were left over others. So that certainly happened, and it's really uncommon. And in fact, anybody enrolled in the current use program, if you're enrolled in that as a landowner, you cannot high grade. It's not allowed in your forest management plan. That has to be approved by the state. And so, the practices now are removing, you're going to remove some nice quality trees because those go into nice wood products, right, that we need, but then also removing some less valuable, poorly formed trees. And that's where this idea of deadwood creation can come in. If that's not valuable to remove from the forest, it might actually be a cost benefit just to drop it and leave it, or leave it in pull it over to a stream, leave it in the stream. And so we're trying to be creative and work with folks to get some of these outcomes, and thinking about ways it can benefit the contractors, the people that depend on working in the woods, the people that have land and need to pay their taxes, right? There's a lot of different players and components into that. But certainly we now know, and there's been a lot of research actually to show there's the implications of a lot of those past practices on the genetic diversity of the forest. A lot of things we don't see. Actually, you see species diversity, but genetic diversity is something we don't see, and that did have implications on the genetics that were left in the forest. Absolutely. Okay, yes, in the back.
I think you mentioned that 80% of rainfall can be returned back through the evapotranspiration. And I'm wondering if you would by any chance have a figure of what a meadow or a field, what their evapotranspiration rate would be.
Yeah, so I don't off the top of my head. It would be, I I think it would be less as far as the transpiration. You can get quite a lot of evaporation from asphalt, right? Think about it on a hot day. But so there can be quite a lot of evaporation from those surfaces, but the transpiration, and the transpiration is pulling up groundwater, right? So that's coming up through the trees. So it's water that went through the soil, coming up through the roots, and then going all the way up through the tree and then out. So it can actually be, it's not new rainwater versus evaporation is often the rain that fell in that storm or a recent storm. So it also slows down that process of the water. But I don't have numbers off the top of my head. But forests definitely, I can say unequivocally, besides wetlands, but forested wetlands are really great. Forests really do this really well as far as like cycling and storing water because of that leaf area that is going to be in much more vertical layers than any, not to discount a meadow is really great and shrubland, but there's so many more layers of leaf area through that system. Yes.
Have you, the evergreen trees you said don't do as well with the capturing of water in the canopy?
They do better.
They do better?
Yeah.
Okay, but the tall white pines where you don't have the big canopies, the more water reaches the ground. Is that the right?
Yeah, I can see how that. Yes, that's a good. Yes,
okay,
good clarification. Yeah.
My question is though, so if more water is in a forest with heavier evergreen content than deciduous content, because the needle versus leaf structure is different.
Yeah.
Which structure can hold more water because of the organic matter, or is it more or less all the same?
In the soils?
Yeah.
You're asking? Okay. So yes, good clarification on the, so in general, a tree that has its leaves year-round, so evergreen. In some places they have evergreen broadleaf trees or rhododendrons, right? Those keep their leaves, a shrub, keep their leaves all year. So it's just the nature of them having their leaves or needles all year are going to provide more interception benefit. But yes, and I did show that photo of the white pine, and those are sort of an anomalous, white pine naturally that's thriving is going to have a much bigger canopy. Those are a vestige of past land use in that they're all growing really closely together. They weren't planted, but they come up in these old agricultural systems, and they had really, small crowns, and they're not very healthy. And so those aren't going to provide too much interception benefit, even though those needles are there year-round. In terms of soil, yes, there are differences. So first we have the leaf litter layer, and actually broadleaves, like a maple leaf or a beech leaf, actually does a really good job holding and trapping water more than a little needle, like a white pine needle. Yeah. But what we see is that there can be different levels of organic matter under those leaves. And maybe you've seen this if you've gone up to sort of the higher elevation spruce fir forests on Mansfield or Camel's Hump. Really cold climates, those needles don't break down very fast. If you dig down in that soil, it'll be really deep of just different layers of decomposed needles from many, many, many years over time. And that can hold quite a lot of water. So it sort of depends on how deep that organic layer is versus other areas. And I will say, like, one of the things we see in a lot of our forests, especially close to agricultural land, is we have earthworms. And earthworms were introduced. They are not a native species in any of our forests. All of our native species were removed in our last glacial period. And so those earthworms churn through that organic material. They're great in your garden because they release nutrients, not great in the forest. They churn through that organic matter, leaf litter in particular. They love maple leaves. They'll churn through that. And so you do see in forests with earthworms, that organic, that rich, dark organic layer will be much smaller. And so, it really depends on, the species there, the climate, earthworms, all these other soil biota living there. Generally, if you have thicker organic layer, better water storage. It just slows it down, acts more as a sponge. Same in your, same in your garden. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I sort of despair because most of the channels, and much of the damage occurs,
Yeah.
are public property.
Yeah.
My road crew, set a hand for all the road crews, right?
Yeah.
But we all want them to fix it immediately and then go make noise elsewhere. But all of our private lands are contributing more water faster
Yeah.
to that gully that gets carved down my road every time.
Absolutely.
Do we have any training from Natural Resource Agency or Agency of Transportation that is helping local road crews understand the larger dynamics and prevent, work with local landowners as much as they can to prevent all this vast outflow
Yeah.
into these public channels? Because they're so expensive. That,
Yeah.
what road crew in the last 2 years has had any time or money to do
No.
anything other than repair?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah. Question. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about, roads, our town and city roads. I totally agree. So I will plug Dr. Beverly Wemple. She's a professor at the University of Vermont. She's done, and I cited her research on the road compaction work. She's done a lot of work, and she works with town road crews and thinking about ways to modify what they're doing to reduce erosion and reduce downstream water quality effects. I think, that's sort of my expertise in the forest. What I see just being a person that lives here and lives in a very steep area is it's challenging. Our roads are built under a different system when we weren't getting maybe these 5-6 inch rain events. And so I totally agree with you. I don't know what the answer is, but it does seem like we need a more unified way to think about this, because some of the small towns like mine are gonna have serious financial issues if we, So yeah, it's a great question. Sorry, I think we need to wrap it up.
I actually want to speak directly to that.
Okay.
Because there's some other connections I want. So the Vermont DEC's Rivers program has a 2-day training called the Rivers and Roads program. It's designed for municipal road crews
Yes.
to learn this stuff. And so if you want to know, what road crews should do, it's that. And I recommend that folks reach out to their public works departments and recommend that road crews take this training. It's offered several times a year. It's
Great.
at UC. It's an awesome program.
What's it called again?
The Rivers and Roads training.
Offered by whom?
The Department of Environmental Conservation, the Rivers program for that.
Yep, great. I think Shane Jaquith has been involved with that maybe in the past too. Yeah, great point.
Any one more question?
Did you have one in the front? Okay. Oh, yes.
I just wondered if you could explain why evapotranspiration has a cooling effect.
Okay. So this is just the process of water becoming vapor. That is basically its latent energy, and so it essentially cools the energy required for that water to go from liquid to gas. Essentially cools the leaf surface, it cools the air. And so we benefit from that. Actually, the tree depends on that process from happening. And the tree depends on that process of transpiration from the stomata. Without that water coming out of those pores, it wouldn't allow, it sort of is like a straw that brings water up passively from the soils up through the roots all the way up to the crown of the tree, which can be, in some cases, we have trees that are hundreds of feet tall and can bring that water up. And that's a process of, capillary action and all those, the process of water molecules that stick together through cohesion. And so it's an incredible thing that gives us both water coming up through trees that can bring deep soil water, but also this cooling effect through that transfer of liquid water to water vapor.
If it closes
Yeah.
drought, doesn't it overheat?
Yes, and so we actually see that. We saw it this summer. We saw leaf scorch. Maple in particular had it. So the leaves basically get necrosis. They die. They start off from the out. Yes, they get too hot. They dehydrate. And, you know, for a deciduous tree, they can handle it. It might have been early, you know, August, they're dropping their leaves. And I saw this if people were around recreating in the woods in August. It looked like it was October in some places. And so it was early leaf drop. And, you know, indeed, we had, I would say, a subpar foliage season because of it. Some places were less affected, and that really had to do with them being moister, other impacts that they, you know, the soil water table and things like that. But dry sites certainly had early leaf drop. And so, yeah, we saw that like crinkling of leaves and browning. And yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming.